So our last presenter, discussant, chief reflector,
Chief reflector, I like that title.
will be Geoff Cohen. Do you have AV or anything?
No.
Can I turn on the lights?
Yeah, that'd be great.
So, well, obviously, Geoff's work on party over policy effect has been very influential for a number of us. So he's kind of an obvious choice to end this particular session, but also Geoff is just as an engaged, intellectual, impactful social psychologist. Geoff has been involved in so many important studies translating psychological theory and ideas into meaningful contexts that really have an impact on people's lives. So Geoff and David, for example, have participated in some studies that may or may not involve some local schools looking at how affirmation can actually reduce the disparities in academic performance between minority, white and non-white students. And I think as we broaden the kind of discussion about what is the role of social behavioral science, we need to think really carefully about how do we actually engage with the public, with politicians, with policymakers, other interested parties to really affect change. And so Geoff seems like the perfect person to lead this discussion, and he's been jotting down notes all day. Crazy.
Yeah.
So he's going to walk us through those notes.
Yeah, don't worry, this will just take a couple hours. So I'm coming at this from a social psychologist, and what I'm interested in as a social psychologist is the power of context. And I don't really study climate attitudes, but I study how beliefs and attitudes are formed in the political realm. And so it's been just really interesting for me to watch all the presentations and try to learn and try to sort of abstract out some issues or questions. And so what I thought I'd do is I feel like in these kinds of conferences it's easy for the details to start to slip through your fingers, and I just wanted to pull the camera back a little bit and maybe just raise a couple questions, a couple issues that might help to guide the conversation or the discussion or the thinking about this really, really interesting area. So I think to pull out a couple themes that I think are important, that kind of come across loud and clear. One is, just to kind of pick up on that last question that Jim raised, is kind of the idea that we live in a very ambiguous and complex world. Right? The climate is an ambiguous and complex system. People and their social systems are complicated. And I feel so there's this interesting tension. On the one hand, we want to be rational decision makers and have our positions based on an impartial consideration of the facts and evidence. On the other hand, we can't go it alone. We need the help of other people to make sense of the facts and the evidence and to put them in their appropriate context. So for example, with the party over policy effect, it may make some sense in a complex, ambiguous world to rely on opinion leaders, what Kotz called opinion leaders, in order to formulate your own opinions, in order to make sense of the evidence at hand. And this is a very natural thing to do. It may be a necessary thing to do. It's not necessarily irrational. And the reason that and it's not mindless conformity, oftentimes what we're doing is making meaning out of ambiguity. So for example, in the Solomon Asch study that Jim cited, people hear a quote, "A little rebellion now and then is a good thing." And it's attributed either to Jefferson or Stalin, right? And people love it, Americans love it when it's attributed to Jefferson, they hate it when it's attributed to Stalin. And that was taken as evidence of, look how mindlessly conforming people are. They just kind of cower under what their peers say. or what they just go with the cue rather than the content of the message. But when Ash looked at how people were thinking, what he found is that actually what they're doing is they're making sense, making meaning out of the statement in light of their group. So Jefferson's, in light of who the source is. So if Jefferson said it, it's like a call to peaceful resistance. If Stalin says it, you're kind of calling to mind bloody revolution. So I think that's really a super important issue. I'm not sure how to handle it, but we just live in such a complex world, and the interesting thing about it is that it's almost all socially mediated. We don't really directly see it. We don't really directly know much about the policy. We don't really know much. I mean, how many of us have read the climate science ourselves? It's kind of transmitted. So I think we kind of live in this world of rife ambiguity, and to some extent, what we need to do is make sense of that ambiguity. And one way we do so is with our groups. So this kind of idea of ambiguity is one big theme, and the necessity of using our groups as kind of context to understand it. I think where we go astray, though, is in failing to realize we're doing it. So in these studies, people are often saying, I made my assessment by myself. I wasn't influenced by my party. The big error lies not so much in being influenced by your group, but by being oblivious to the fact that it's affecting you, I think. Okay. Second idea that I think comes across is this notion that attitude change, the problem of attitude change is different from the problem of behavior change. So people's beliefs that climate change is a reality and that it's caused by human activity does not perfectly predict their behavior. This is a notion that actually goes back to old research by the pioneer of social psychology, Kurt Lewin, and he would talk about how attitudes often come after the fact, hearts and minds change after the behavior has occurred. So Lewin would emphasize this notion that to change behavior is often a different endeavor from changing an attitude. And that might be an idea that we could import from social psychology to climate science. For example, there's this old research on getting people to take the health steps that they need to take. In this case, this was back in the 60s, getting them to get their tetanus shot. And what they did in one intervention was to scare the hell out of people. If you don't get your tetanus shot, this is what you're going to look like. Pictures, people in titanic convulsions with gaping tracheotomy wounds. And so they scare them. And that's kind of the approach we take with environmental science. Like, as we saw with some of Ken's research, people sometimes shut down when they get that threatening information. What they found is that fear changed people's attitudes. They became more positive towards the idea of getting their tetanus shot. But it had no impact on whether or not they actually showed up at the health center to get a tetanus shot. Instead, what mattered was a little channel factor, making the behavior easier to do, a nudge, asking people to check their calendar, to set up a time to go to the health center, giving them a map of campus with the health center circled on the map, which is a little weird because these are all senior students. Presumably they know their way around campus, and presumably they know how to check their calendar. But this little nudge helped catalyze the impact of their attitudes. It wasn't fear so much as opening a behavioral channel that led to change. And I think that idea might be something that we could import into the realm of environmental science. This notion that maybe sometimes what we need to do is make the behavior easier rather than change hearts and minds. Dave Sherman and others and I have come up with this term called nudge and flow. So we all know the nudge idea. You kind of nudge people a little bit and they change for the better in the right time, in the right place. Flow is just this idea that if you do it in the right time, in the right place, people can enter a flow of forces that propels them forward. So in the school domain, for example, a little nudge to get poor kids is like 10 minutes of coaching to give them a little help filling out the financial aid application, not only leads them to fill out the financial aid application to go to college, but actually leads them to be more likely to go to college and even graduate from college. Once you fill out that financial application, you're kind of just, you're just pulled along by the riptide. And I think this idea of changing behaviors at moments of positive flow might be something that we could play with in the environmental domain. Okay, the kind of notion that the world is socially mediated, ambiguous word, socially mediated, the notion that attitude change the problem of attitude change is different from the problem of behavior change. The third theme I think that comes up, at least for me, in a lot of these talks, is the importance of groups and group identity. The power of groups and group identity. I think we may have this conception of people that's wrong in our efforts at social change. We kind of see people as individual actors who make their independent judgments based on a rational assessment of pros and cons. But Kurt Lewin argued that in reality, what is often most important to people in organizing their action are the groups to which they belong. And he called this groups the kind of ground on which people stand. And a lot of the kind of research that was highlighted seems to kind of bring up the power of group identity. I mean, the data showing that white men or whites at least, they're the problem. That they are the political polarization in America, at least along climate science, at least in terms of the climate, is among whites. That's interesting. More primarily among whites. The role of partisan identities in shaping people's responses to social policy. That's another example of the power of the group. I also think there's this other aspect of the group that we haven't fully unpacked, which is the importance of what John Ogbu called sort of oppositional identity. So a lot of times our group identities are formed in opposition. We say, not only do I want to be that kind of person, but we say, I don't want to be that. And I think some of the studies we heard today dovetail with that notion of an oppositional identity, such as the discussion of if it's brown, put it down, that effect. Or like when
that's a different effect.
Or when conservatives are told this light bulb is good for the environment, then they don't buy it. Maybe anti-environmental behaviors is something we should be looking at when people sort of kind of go out of their way to do something that's really bad for the environment. Maybe we should be looking at that. I'm struck by those correlations showing that at the low end, where people don't believe that the climate is changing for the worse, that low end, Republicans, everyone's less supportive of climate policy, but Democrats are around the neutral point, and Republicans are like, no way, we do not want to do that. The slope is steeper for that. So for Republicans or conservatives, they're going from skepticism to opposition, which isn't necessarily rational. I mean, you could say, well, we should hedge our bets. I'm not sure if this is real. I don't quite believe it, but maybe we should take some precautionary steps. But no, they're kind of taking this sort of oppositional stance. And I think that may be something we should be looking at, because one of the other things that comes out in one of the papers was how, at least in Congresses, in a lot of Congresses, people like Republicans who believe in climate change, they want to support, they feel ambivalent about speaking out because they're going to be attacked by the 15% who deny climate change. So that kind of opposition, it takes only a few people to create a toxic environment. And maybe the few people who create that toxic environment are these people who have an oppositional identity in this domain. So the importance of groups not only as a barrier to change, but as a catalyst to change. Kurt Lewin would show one of the best ways to get people to change is to take them out of an existing group and put them in a new group. the group can be a catalyst to change. He would say it's even easier to change a group than an individual, because otherwise you're trying to change the individual against the tide and the norms of the group. Instead, like, change the whole group or create a new group with new norms and sweep them along in one fell swoop. And so he would do these studies. I think that they should be perhaps replicated in the environment domain of the environment on group process. For example, during the war, he was trying to get homemakers to buy these really cheap cut meats for the war effort, like things like pancreas and kidneys, and no one wanted to buy it. It was kind of an identity issue, like Americans felt like, we can't serve this. So what he did was he took the homemakers out of their existing familial groups, put them in a new group of strangers, the small group, with a democratic leader to lead a discussion on this issue. What barriers stand in the way of you serving these foods at least once? And what he found that was that creation of a new group with new norms and a new commitment to change, because at the end he would say, how many of you could try these foods at least once, led to enduring behavior change. Far more homemakers purchased the meats over the long term in that condition than in a condition where they were simply exposed to propaganda about how this is good for the war effort. So it wasn't arguments and evidence and strong-arm salesmanship that changed people. It was taking them out of an existing group and all of its restraints and putting them in a new group with new norms that propelled action forward. So I think that idea too could be really imported here. The power of the small group. Lewin believed that we could transform culture through one small group at a time. Okay, so object of judgment, ambiguity in the social world, the importance of the group and oppositional group identities, the group as a catalyst and a barrier to change. And then just the final point that came across here is the importance of the larger social context. So psychology takes place in a larger social context. This came up, like, psychological systems exist in social systems. So there's, this kind of riptide idea goes to this. There's some research in voting showing that if a person votes in one election because of canvassers, they go to door and they motivate people to vote, then they're more likely to vote in the next election. Now, partly that's about identity, like it's sort of like the foot in the door. I voted, therefore I'm a person who votes. But part of it is also due to the larger system of forces that then intrudes as a result of voting in that first election. The people who vote are then put on canvassers' lists as people to get in touch for their candidate, and they're put on mailing lists, which then motivate them later or try to encourage them to go out and vote at subsequent occasions. So it's like that initial step leads them to act in a way that, the initial step is that they vote, but then the social world reacts to that and makes it more likely that they continue to vote. So I think we need to think about how not only to kind of trigger a psychological change, but then how to sustain it through the social context, through the kind of reactions that the social context give. In an institution like a school or a workplace, that's already there. You kind of get a person acting and the system reacts. You do a good job, people validate you. But in this world, I'm not so sure how to do that. It might have a lot to do with sort of social visibility and validations that we can introduce. But this idea is, the bigger idea is that psychology takes place in a larger system of forces, and that system of forces helps to carry any change forward. Likewise, another example of this that I thought was really just stuck with me, of the importance of this social context. Michael Bennett, a senator here from Colorado, was interviewed on the Ezra Klein show. He was so interesting. But one of the things he said that really stuck with me is the fact that partisanship determines policy content. So the polarization, he says, that you see in Congress is partly the result of the limited and uncreative array of options that representatives have to vote on.
There's really good evidence that
Yeah,
political science
yeah.
that it's all about agenda control.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
What what the options are.
Yeah, well, so the limited array of options. So to some extent, the kind of, so to a large extent, the social context also kind of sets the array of options that psychology then acts on. Okay, so those were the three big themes that came up, for kind of issues that I was grappling with. The sort of notion of ambiguity, the importance of the group as a barrier or catalyst to change, the notion that all psychology takes place in a larger social context, and maybe there's like new solutions, given the importance of the social context and the array of options, maybe there's new solutions we can offer. I'm thinking of the analogy in capital punishment, where suddenly you had conservatives supporting getting rid of capital punishment when it was called something else, when it was called not abolishing capital punishment, but putting a moratorium on it until we figure out what's going on with all these wrongly convicted people. So maybe we need sort of new solutions, new choices to bring people together, new creative choices. So those are the three ideas. I think one last kind of closing point is the thing that I think would be great to see more of are intervention studies. Like as Kurt Lewin also said, the best way to understand something is to try to change it. And I think what I would love to see is more studies kind of out there in field context, intervening and assessing long-term outcomes, not just on self-report, but on actual behavior, much like Cialdini does and Todd Rogers does and some of the research presented here. I really think that would be a great thing to do. I think like one of the first environmental studies, this will be the last study I mentioned, in social psychology was the old foot in the door study, right, where they asked people, a long story short, will you put up this little sign, "Keep California Beautiful," in your window? And that essentially quadrupled the percentage of people who agreed 2 weeks later to put up a big, ugly, sorry, I'm conflating it, a big, ugly sign on a similar theme in their front yard. So just that small initial act of saying, I believe in keeping California clean, led them to take a larger identity relevant step and put up a big sign in their front yard. That kind of studies would be good, but it would be actually better to finish it, because the interesting thing about that study, the Friedman and Fraser study, is that they didn't finish it. So people didn't actually have the chance to put the sign up in their front yard. They just acquiesced to it. So what would happen if they put the sign up? Would they actually put it up? How would their neighbors react? How would their neighbors' reaction to their action affect them and their psychology, both in the short term and the long term? I think like looking at doing studies that look at how a nudge at a timely moment of flow can lead to enduring behavioral consequences, when, where, for whom, is a great direction to go in. So thanks.
Thank you, Geoff. That was excellent and very, very thought-provoking. Thank you all for spending the day with us, or part of the day with us. It's been incredibly stimulating and exhausting. And so we're going to stop now and go take a stroll, and I think there will be some happy houring where we can make all the important decisions.
Nice.
So thank you again, and we look forward to interacting more with all of you. Thanks.